Moving past the harrowing state of medieval medicine and sanitation, we must examine the precarious nature of the daily diet and the fragile thread upon which the food supply hung. For the vast majority of the population, survival was entirely dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the whims of the weather. There were no supermarkets, no refrigeration, and very few ways to preserve food for extended periods. If a single harvest failed due to an unexpected drought, excessive rainfall, or a late frost, an entire region could be plunged into catastrophic famine. The period between late spring and early summer was notoriously known as the lean season, a grueling time when the previous year's stores had completely run out, and the new crops were not yet ready to be harvested. During these months, peasants were forced to forage for wild roots, bark, and weeds just to keep starvation at bay. Even when food was available, it lacked nutritional variety. The staple of the peasant diet was a dark, dense bread made of rye or barley, accompanied by a thick vegetable pottage. Meat was a rare luxury strictly reserved for special occasions or entirely monopolized by the nobility, who strictly enforced poaching laws in the lord's forests. Beyond the constant threat of outright starvation, the food that was available often carried hidden, invisible dangers. Due to poor storage conditions, grains were frequently damp and prone to rotting. One of the most terrifying afflictions of the Middle Ages was ergodism, historically referred to as St. Anthony's fire. This devastating condition was caused by a toxic fungus that grew on wet rye grains. When unsuspecting peasants ground this infected grain into flour and baked it into bread, the results were horrific. The toxins caused severe hallucinations, a burning sensation in the limbs, and in severe cases, gangrene that caused flesh to rot away. Because medieval society lacked any understanding of fungal contamination, victims believed they were being possessed by demons or punished by divine wrath, adding an immense psychological terror to an already excruciating physical torment. The struggle for survival did not ease when a peasant finally returned home after a long, exhausting day of labor in the fields. In fact, the average medieval home was a breeding ground for discomfort and disease. Peasants lived in small one-room hovels constructed from wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks, mud, and straw, with thatched roofs. These dwellings lacked windows, leaving the interior perpetually dark and damp. Most critically, early medieval homes did not have chimneys. A central hearth was used for cooking and warmth, but the smoke had no direct escape route except for a small hole in the roof or through the porous thatch itself. Consequently, the air inside was constantly thick with acrid smoke, leading to chronic respiratory illnesses, eye infections, and lung diseases among families who spent their winters huddled around the fire. During the brutal winter months, the harsh climate introduced another severe layer of hardship. Insulation was practically non-existent, and the Donduruku cold could easily claim the lives of the young and the elderly overnight. To combat the freezing temperatures, families resorted to a desperate measure, bringing their livestock inside the living space. Cows, pigs, and sheep were kept in the very same room where the family slept, utilizing the animal's body heat to keep the indoor temperature just above freezing. While this practical solution saved many from hypothermia, it turned the home into a sanctuary for parasites. The straw bedding on the floor, rarely changed and heavily soiled, became a thriving habitat for fleas, lice, and rodents. These pests were not merely nuisances, they were deadly vectors for typhus, microscopic parasites, and the devastating plagues that periodically swept through Europe, turning the home from a place of shelter into a dangerous trap. If a peasant somehow managed to survive the soot-filled, parasite-ridden confines of their home, the very act of entering the world was their first and most dangerous trial. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a terrifying gamble with death for both the mother and the infant. Without any comprehension of germs or bacteria, midwives relied entirely on folklore, religious charms, and herbal concoctions rather than hygiene or anatomical science. The risk of postpartum infection, often referred to as childbed fever, was astronomical. Even if the mother survived the agonizing process, the newborn faced a brutal gauntlet of vulnerabilities. Historians estimate that nearly a third of all children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Childhood diseases that are easily preventable or treatable today, such as measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, and smallpox, tore through rural villages and cramped city streets with terrifying regularity. To survive childhood in the medieval era was, quite literally, to win a demographic lottery. For those resilient enough to reach adulthood, life offered no respite, only endless, back-breaking toil. The vast majority of the population lived as serfs, individuals legally bound to the land and beholden to their local lord. While not enslaved in the classical sense, they were far from free. They could not leave the manor, marry, or even grind their own wheat without the lord's explicit permission and the payment of heavy fees. From the moment the sun breached the horizon until it plunged into the dark, men and women worked the fields using heavy, primitive tools. The physical toll of this relentless manual labor was profound. Skeletal remains from medieval graveyards reveal a grim reality. Severe osteoarthritis, worn-down joints, healed bone fractures, and spinal deformities were commonplace in individuals as young as 30. The human body was treated as a disposable agricultural tool, meant to be utilized until it simply broke down under the crushing weight of feudal obligations, taxes, and the mandatory tithes demanded by the church. Yet, even a lifetime of quiet obedience and bone-crushing labor could not guarantee safety from the rampant violence of the era. The Middle Ages was a deeply militarized and politically fractured society, where local barons, dukes, and rival kings constantly squabbled over territory, succession, and honor. When war inevitably broke out, it was rarely fought in the glorious, pitched battles of honorable knights depicted in Hollywood movies. Instead, medieval warfare relied heavily on a brutal military strategy known as the chevauchée. This was an organized campaign of raiding where armies would intentionally bypass heavily fortified castles to target the soft underbelly of the enemy, the peasant villages. Invading soldiers would systematically burn houses, slaughter livestock, poison wells, and destroy the crops waiting in the fields. The goal was to financially ruin the rival lord by starving his subjects. The peasant, therefore, was always the primary victim of elite political disputes, caught completely defenseless in the crossfire of heavily armored men who viewed them as little more than economic collateral damage. Furthermore, when the lords were not waging war against one another, the roads and dark, untamed forests connecting isolated villages were deeply perilous. These areas were prowled by outlaws, military deserters, and desperate men driven to banditry by famine or exile. There was no organized police force to call upon, no state protection for the commoner. If a village was raided by bandits or a merchant was ambushed on a lonely dirt road, they were entirely on their own. Even the formal justice system of the era offered little comfort or fairness to the lower classes. Medieval law was notoriously harsh and heavily relied on physical punishment or the terrifying concept of trial by ordeal. If a peasant was accused of a crime and there were no witnesses, they might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar or plunge their arm into a cauldron of boiling water. If the severe burn did not heal cleanly within a few days, the festering wound was taken as undeniable divine proof of their guilt. For those found guilty of theft, poaching, or treason, public mutilation, such as the loss of an ear or a hand, or theatrical executions were carried out in the town square, serving as a brutal, psychological reminder to keep the starving masses in a state of perpetual fear and absolute submission. As devastating as warfare, famine, and brutal laws were, the ultimate test of human endurance during the Middle Ages arrived invisibly, carried on the backs of rats and the fleas that infested them. In the mid-14th century, a cataclysmic event fundamentally altered the course of human history: the Black Death. For a medieval peasant already weakened by malnutrition and poor hygiene, the arrival of the bubonic plague was indistinguishable from the biblical apocalypse. Society had absolutely no defense mechanism against this aggressive pathogen. The symptoms were horrific: agonizingly swollen lymph nodes known as buboes, soaring fevers, and the coughing up of blood. The lethality and speed of the disease were so terrifying that a person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy and be dead before midnight. Entire villages were wiped off the map, and in densely packed cities, the death toll was so astronomical that graveyards overflowed, forcing survivors to dig massive, unmarked trench graves. It is estimated that the plague eradicated anywhere from a third to half of Europe's entire population in just a few short years, leaving the survivors to wander through a traumatized, echoing world. The sheer scale of this mortality bred a profound psychological darkness. Surviving the Middle Ages meant navigating a landscape governed entirely by fear, dogma, and violent superstition. Because the medieval mind could not comprehend the microscopic world of bacteria or viruses, every disaster, be it a failed crop, a sudden illness, or a sweeping plague, had to have a supernatural explanation. This intense paranoia required scapegoats. Marginalized communities, travelers, and individuals suffering from mental illnesses or physical deformities were frequently accused of poisoning wells or practicing dark magic. The village midwife or healer, who relied on generations of herbal knowledge to treat local ailments, suddenly found herself highly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. The collective trauma of the era created a suffocating atmosphere where neighbor would eagerly turn on neighbor, and religious zealots roamed the countryside whipping themselves to appease what they believed was a furious god. To stand out, to question the established order, or simply to be in the wrong place at the wrong time was an open invitation to the Inquisitor's torture chamber. Even if a desperate peasant decided to abandon the grueling life of agricultural serfdom and flee to the growing urban centers in search of freedom, they merely traded rural miseries for a concentrated urban nightmare. Medieval towns and cities were heavily fortified, surrounded by massive stone defensive walls, which discovered that the most efficient killer in a medieval army was not the sword, but the war camp itself. As thousands of men and horses congregated in muddy, unsanitary fields, the local water sources were instantly contaminated with human and animal waste. The medieval military camp was a sprawling, apocalyptic slum of canvas and mud, plagued by unimaginable biological hazards. Camp fever, what modern medicine recognizes as epidemic typhus, spread by the millions of body lice infesting the soldiers' unwashed clothing, swept through the ranks with terrifying speed. Alongside typhus was the ever-present specter of the bloody flux, or severe dysentery. Armies were frequently decimated not by enemy action, but by catastrophic outbreaks of bacterial infections that caused severe, fatal dehydration. Soldiers were so weakened by disease that entire campaigns had to be abandoned because the men were physically incapable of lifting their weapons or standing up from the latrine trenches. The mortality rate from disease in these camps vastly outnumbered the casualties of actual combat, turning the supposed glory of military service into a squalid, agonizing death in a freezing, feces-filled ditch miles away from home. When the armies finally moved on, they left behind a landscape that had been fundamentally altered by death. The aftermath of a medieval battle was a grim, highly organized theater of scavenging. Because poverty was absolute, the bodies of the fallen were not respected. They were viewed as a sudden vital source of resources. Local villagers, known as camp followers or looters, would swarm the battlefield under the cover of darkness. They systematically stripped the dead and the dying of everything valuable: leather boots, wool cloaks, rusted daggers, and even the iron buckles from their belts. The dead were left completely naked in the mud, eventually to be hastily tossed into massive, unmarked mass graves by the exhausted victors, ensuring that thousands of men simply vanished from history, leaving their families in permanent, agonizing uncertainty. This pervasive atmosphere of death and helplessness bled deeply into how the medieval mind interpreted the physical universe, particularly the sky above them. Because the average person could not read a map or comprehend the vastness of the earth, the sky was the only absolute boundary they knew. However, it was not viewed as a serene canopy of stars. It was seen as a massive, terrifying canvas upon which God actively painted warnings of impending doom. Celestial anomalies, which modern science easily predicts and explains, were enough to plunge entire nations into a state of paralyzed, collective terror. The appearance of a comet, for instance, was universally interpreted as a highly concentrated omen of catastrophe. The glowing tail was often depicted in manuscripts as a flaming sword hanging directly over the earth, signaling incoming plagues, the death of kings, or a divine punishment for the sins of the peasantry. When Halley's Comet appeared in the medieval sky, agricultural labor ground to a halt. People flocked to the churches, whipping themselves in frantic, desperate penance, entirely convinced that the glowing streak in the night sky was the literal harbinger of the apocalypse. But nothing shattered the fragile psychology of a medieval village quite like a total solar eclipse. In a world utterly dependent on the sun for warmth, crop growth, and the measurement of time, the sudden, unnatural blotting out of the sun in the middle of the day was an event of indescribable horror. Without astronomical warnings, the temperature would suddenly drop, the birds would stop singing, and a twilight gloom would wash over the fields. The peasants believed that God was physically turning his face away from the earth, or that a demonic entity was actively devouring the sun. The absolute silence that fell over a village during an eclipse was the silence of a people who believed they were witnessing the final earthly suffering. The medieval peasant had to construct a heavy psychological armor, one forged entirely from religious dogma and absolute submission. The medieval world was a deeply spiritual one, but this spirituality was overwhelmingly rooted in terror rather than comfort. The church was the absolute, unquestioned authority in every aspect of life, and it painted a terrifying picture of the afterlife. The miseries of the physical world were constantly preached to be a mere testing ground, a temporary, necessary punishment for the original sin of mankind. But the true terror lay in what came after death. The concept of purgatory, a realm of agonizing, fiery purification where souls would suffer for thousands of years to burn away their earthly sins before entering heaven, was a very real geographic certainty in the medieval mind. Because sudden, unexpected death from disease, accident, or violence was always lingering just outside the door, the anxiety of dying with unconfessed sins was paralyzing. The religious institutions of the era heavily monetized this perpetual fear. Peasants who could barely afford to feed their own children were legally obligated to pay the tithe, giving 10% of all their agricultural produce, livestock and labor directly to the local parish, regardless of whether it was a year of plenty or a year of famine. Furthermore, if the male head of a household died, the local lord or priest would frequently claim the family's best beast, or most valuable possession as a death tax, plunging the grieving survivors even deeper into inescapable poverty just when they were most vulnerable. For those remarkable few who somehow survived the diseases, the famines, the backbreaking labor, and the wars to reach old age, a rare feat generally considered to be anything past 50, there was absolutely no social safety net, no retirement, and no state-sponsored care. If an elderly serf's body finally gave out and they could no longer swing a scythe, chop wood, or grind wheat, they instantly became a heavy economic burden on their own struggling family. Those who were disabled by horrific farming accidents, orphaned by the plague, or abandoned by kin who could not feed them had no choice but to join the vast, desperate armies of beggars. They congregated outside church doors, city gates, and along muddy trade routes, relying entirely on the unpredictable, often meager charity of passers-by who were usually just one bad harvest away from joining them in the mud. Life from birth to death was an unbroken chain of endurance, where merely waking up to see the next sunrise was the greatest victory a medieval person could hope to achieve. For those who sought salvation or simply an escape from the suffocating grip of their local lord, the open road offered a completely different set of fatal hazards. Traveling in the Middle Ages was not an adventure. It was an exercise in extreme, often deadly endurance. The once magnificent paved Roman roads had long since crumbled into disrepair, replaced by muddy, deeply rutted tracks that became impassable, freezing swamps during the spring thaws and autumn rains. To step beyond the familiar boundaries of one's village was to enter a vast, unmapped wilderness where nature itself was a formidable enemy. Dense, foreboding forests covered much of the European continent, harboring wild boars, wolf packs that grew exceptionally bold and aggressive during harsh winters, and the ever-present threat of exiled outlaws. If a commoner wished to travel, their only socially acceptable excuse was a religious pilgrimage. Yet, setting out for distant shrines in Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem meant walking hundreds of miles with nothing but a wooden staff, a woolen cloak, and a leather pouch of stale bread. Pilgrims relied entirely on the sporadic hospitality of monasteries, sleeping in crowded, flea-infested hospices where they were just as likely to contract a fatal disease from a fellow traveler as they were to find spiritual absolution. A staggering number of pilgrims never returned home, their bodies left in unmarked graves along the muddy routes, serving as grim milestones for those who followed. Even if a peasant miraculously accumulated a small amount of wealth through trade, skilled craftsmanship, or a remarkably lucky harvest, they were strictly forbidden from using it to visibly improve their social standing. The medieval world was a rigid, immovable hierarchy believed to be ordained directly by God, and to attempt to climb out of one's designated caste was viewed as a deeply subversive, even heretical act. This rigid class structure was fiercely enforced through what were known as sumptuary laws. These were highly specific, draconian legal codes that dictated exactly what a person was allowed to wear, eat, and purchase based entirely on their birth and social rank. A commoner was legally prohibited from wearing bright, expensive dyes like crimson red or royal blue, and they were barred from touching luxurious fabrics like silk, velvet, or fine lace. Even the length of a shoe's pointed toe, the amount of fur trimming on a winter coat, or the number of courses served at a private dinner were strictly regulated by law. If a wealthy merchant or an ambitious peasant was caught wearing clothing deemed above their station, they faced severe public humiliation, heavy financial ruin, or the outright confiscation of their property. You were born into the dirt, and the law ensured you visually belonged to the dirt until the day you died, systematically stripping away any psychological hope of upward mobility. Within this oppressive, unyielding hierarchy, the survival of medieval women was fraught with an entirely unique, often silent set of perils. From birth, a woman was viewed legally and socially as the property of her father and later, her husband. She had virtually no independent legal standing. In most regions she could not testify in court, own land in her own name, or choose her own path in life. For the peasant woman, daily life was an agonizing double burden. She was expected to perform relentless agricultural labor in the fields alongside the men, while simultaneously shouldering the endless domestic duties of spinning wool, carrying heavy buckets of water, brewing the daily ale, and raising children in a highly toxic, disease-ridden environment. If her husband died, her situation could become instantly catastrophic. While a widow might briefly inherit a portion of her husband's land, she immediately became a prime, vulnerable target for predatory neighbors, corrupt local officials, and even her own lord. The local baron could arbitrarily and forcibly remarry her to a man of his choosing, simply to ensure that the land continued to produce taxes and grain for his estate, completely erasing her brief moment of autonomy. Furthermore, the few avenues of independence available to women were fraught with societal paranoia and deadly consequences. For example, brewing ale was historically a female-dominated domestic task, necessary because the water was too dangerous to drink. Some women, known as alewives, managed to turn this daily chore into a profitable, independent business, placing tall wooden brooms outside their doors to signal to the village that a fresh batch of beer was ready. However, as brewing became a highly lucrative commercial industry toward the late Middle Ages, male-dominated guilds aggressively and violently pushed women out of the trade. To destroy their female competition, they launched vicious smear campaigns, deliberately associating the traditional harmless imagery of the alewife, her large bubbling brewing cauldron, her broomstick, and the cats she kept to chase rats away from her grain sacks, with dark magic and witchcraft. This insidious economic tactic directly fed into the horrific hysterical witch panics of the later centuries. It turned the mere act of a woman trying to independently survive into a capital crime, punishable by torture and being burned at the stake. In the Middle Ages, survival was a precarious tightrope walk over a bottomless chasm of disaster. But for women, that tightrope was actively being cut by the very society they labored to support. Beyond the rigid social laws and the constant threat of starvation, there was a daily, inescapable psychological burden that modern society has entirely forgotten: the sheer, suffocating terror of the medieval night. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the medieval world was plunged into an absolute, inky darkness that is impossible to replicate in our modern, electrified era. Candles made of beeswax were an extreme luxury reserved exclusively for the church and the nobility. The common peasant had to rely on rushlights, dried reeds dipped in leftover animal fat, which burned quickly, smoked terribly, smelled of rancid meat, and provided barely enough light to see one's own hands. Because artificial light was so scarce and expensive, human life was strictly governed by the sun. As darkness fell, a profound, primal fear took hold of the population. The night was universally viewed as the domain of thieves, nocturnal predators, and supernatural horrors. Demons, malicious spirits, and the restless dead were not considered fairy tales. They were accepted as absolute, terrifying realities that roamed the earth after sunset. Curfews were strictly enforced in walled towns not just for fire safety, but to prevent the rampant crime that flourished in the unlit, winding alleys. People locked their sturdy wooden doors, barred their heavy shutters, and huddled together in the stifling, smoky dark, praying simply to see the dawn. Because the nights were so incredibly long, especially during the brutal winter months when the sun set in the late afternoon, medieval people experienced sleep entirely differently than we do today. Out of sheer necessity, they practiced what historians now call biphasic sleep. A peasant family would go to bed on their straw mattresses shortly after dusk, sleep for about 4 hours, and then wake up in the middle of the night for a period known as the watch. During this eerie, quiet hour, people would pray, tend to the dying embers of the hearth, patch ragged clothing in the dim light, or simply listen to the terrifying sounds of the wind and howling wolf packs outside their fragile wattle and daub walls. After an hour or two of this quiet wakefulness, they would return to bed for their second sleep, until sunrise. This fractured sleep cycle was a direct biological adaptation to a world where the dark was excessively long, bitterly cold, and profoundly dangerous. Within this dark, demanding, and labor-intensive world, the modern concept of childhood simply did not exist. Children were not viewed as innocent, fragile beings requiring years of play, nurturing, and education. Rather, they were viewed as miniature, flawed adults and, most importantly, as free, necessary labor. From the moment a child was physically capable of understanding and following instructions, usually around the age of 5 or 6, they were put to work. Young boys and girls were sent barefoot into the freezing fields to pick up heavy stones, scare away crows from the precious seeds, or forage in the woods for edible weeds and nuts. By the age of 10, they were performing the same back-breaking agricultural tasks as their parents, swinging scythes and hauling heavy buckets of water. Because both mother and father were forced to labor constantly from dawn to dusk just to meet their feudal quotas and avoid starvation, infants and toddlers were frequently left completely unsupervised for hours in the highly dangerous environment of the medieval home or village. Coroners' rolls from the era are filled with heartbreaking, entirely preventable tragedies. Toddlers falling into boiling cauldrons of pottage over the open hearth, wandering into the deep woods never to be seen again, or being trampled by panicked livestock in the muddy streets. To be a child in the Middle Ages was to navigate a deadly obstacle course with zero protection, and those who survived were hardened into stoic, traumatized adults before they even reached puberty. And trauma was, perhaps, the most universal yet entirely unspoken epidemic of the Middle Ages. The average medieval person lived in a state of perpetual bereavement and hypervigilance. They watched half of their children die in infancy, they saw their friends and neighbors succumb to agonizing plagues in a matter of days, they endured the psychological torture of slow starvation during famine years, and they lived in constant, agonizing terror of eternal damnation. Today, medical professionals would recognize this as complex, severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, on a massive, societal scale. However, the medieval world offered absolutely no psychological support. Mental illness, severe depression, and trauma-induced breakdowns were not recognized as medical or psychological conditions. Instead, they were deeply stigmatized as signs of profound moral failing, demonic possession, or a lack of religious faith. Those suffering from severe mental health crises were often subjected to horrific, barbaric cures. They might be chained in the freezing, dark cellars of monasteries, subjected to brutal and physically abusive exorcisms, or undergo trepanation, a terrifying surgical procedure where a hole was literally drilled into the patient's skull without any anesthesia, under the misguided belief that it would let the evil spirits and bad humors escape from the brain. You were expected to bear your immense, crushing suffering in complete, stoic silence, offering your pain to God. When we look back at the Middle Ages through the romanticized lens of modern fantasy, we see the soaring castles, the glittering crowns, and the honorable chivalry. But the true gritty history of this era is a testament to the raw, terrifying, and almost unimaginable resilience of the human species. Every single person alive today is the direct descendant of a medieval peasant who somehow managed to dodge the Black Death, survive the freezing, crop-killing winters of the Little Ice Age, endure the brutal exploitation of feudal lords, and find just enough moldy bread to keep themselves and their children alive for one more day. The Middle Ages was not a fairy tale of princesses and knights. It was a grueling, centuries-long survival test in the mud and the dark. And the fact that humanity made it through that abyss is, perhaps, the most epic and triumphant story ever recorded. While the Black Death stands out as the ultimate biological catastrophe, the mosaic of medieval suffering was vast, and one did not need to wait for a continent-wide plague to experience the absolute fragility of life. For centuries leading up to the plague, society was haunted by a slower, deeply stigmatized horror: leprosy. To be diagnosed with leprosy in the Middle Ages was not merely a medical tragedy, it was a legally mandated social death. Because the disease caused disfigurement and was entirely misunderstood, it was universally viewed as a physical manifestation of internal sin and moral corruption. When a person was suspected of harboring the disease, they were subjected to a terrifying religious and legal ritual. The afflicted individual was literally read their last rites by a priest, forced to stand in an open grave, and sprinkled with dirt as if they had already died. From that moment on, they were stripped of all property, their marriage was legally annulled, and they were banished from society to live in isolated leper colonies or wander the edges of the wilderness. To ensure they did not mingle with the healthy, they were forced by law to wear a heavy, distinctive cloak and constantly ring a bell or swing a wooden clapper to announce their infectious approach. They were entirely forbidden from drinking from public wells, touching merchandise in the market, or speaking to healthy people unless standing downwind. For the medieval leper, survival meant enduring years of agonizing physical decay while completely severed from human warmth, family, and dignity. Even for those healthy enough to escape the mud of the agricultural fields by learning a specialized trade, the urban workforce was a landscape of unregulated, fatal hazards. Today we stand in awe beneath the vaulted ceilings of medieval cathedrals, marveling at the stained glass and towering stone spires. However, we rarely consider the immense human cost required to construct these architectural wonders. The master stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers who built these towering monuments worked at dizzying heights on fragile, rudimentary wooden scaffolding tied together with hemp ropes. Without a single safety harness, hard hat, or modern pulley system, a sudden gust of wind, a snapped rope, or a moment of exhaustion meant a plummeting death onto the cobblestones below. The mortar of Europe's greatest cathedrals is metaphorically, and sometimes literally, mixed with the blood of the workers. Below ground, the situation was even more hellish. Miners extracting iron, copper, and silver for the nobility's armor and currency worked in claustrophobic, pitch-black tunnels prone to sudden collapses and deadly gas pockets. They labored by the dim, oxygen-stealing light of tallow candles, constantly breathing in toxic rock dust that would eventually calcify their lungs. For the medieval laborer, possessing a specialized skill did not grant safety. It simply dictated the specific, violent manner in which their body would ultimately be destroyed by their work. If a commoner managed to avoid catastrophic injury, they still had to navigate a deeply predatory economic system where falling into debt was a physical crime rather than a mere financial setback. The medieval economy was incredibly volatile, heavily reliant on the unpredictable yield of the harvest. If a craftsman could not sell his wares, or a peasant could not afford to pay the required feudal taxes after a drought, they were forced to borrow from local moneylenders at extortionate, unregulated interest rates. When the inevitable default occurred, there was no concept of bankruptcy protection. The debtor was aggressively seized by local bailiffs and thrown directly into a debtor's prison, dank, freezing, and disease-ridden dungeons situated beneath the town halls or local castles. These prisons did not provide food, water, or blankets to their inmates. The burden of keeping the prisoner alive fell entirely on their already destitute family on the outside, who had to bring them daily rations. If the family could not afford to feed the prisoner, or if the prisoner had no family, they would simply starve to death in the dark. The only way out was for the family to somehow scrape together the funds to pay off the original debt, plus the jailer's fees for the duration of the confinement, creating a vicious, inescapable cycle of generational poverty. This utter lack of mercy permeated the entire medieval justice system, which functioned less as an institution of fairness and more as an instrument of state-sanctioned terror designed to keep the starving lower classes in check. The concept of an impartial investigation or forensic evidence was completely non-existent. Guilt was frequently determined by forced confessions extracted through unspeakable torture methods. The rack, the strapado, and the crushing of limbs were legally sanctioned tools used by inquisitors and local magistrates to break the will of the accused. Once a confession was obtained, regardless of whether it was true, as any person will eventually confess to anything to stop the agony, the punishments were highly public, theatrical, and grotesquely violent. For petty crimes like stealing a loaf of bread, an individual might be locked in the pillory in the center of the town square, where angry mobs would pelt them with rotting vegetables, stones, and animal feces, often resulting in permanent blinding or death by mob violence. For heavier crimes, the state orchestrated elaborate executions meant to serve as grim entertainment and a psychological warning. The sheer brutality of the law ensured that the medieval peasant walked a razor-thin line. A single desperate mistake, a false accusation by a jealous neighbor, or merely being in the wrong place at the wrong time could instantly drag them into a bureaucratic nightmare of torture and public execution from which there was absolutely no escape. Even when the commoner sought refuge behind the seemingly impenetrable stone walls of a fortified city or a lord's castle during times of war, they often found that their sanctuary was in reality a meticulously designed death trap. Siege warfare was the dominant military strategy of the Middle Ages, and its primary weapon was not the sword or the trebuchet, but time and mass starvation. When an invading army encircled a settlement, they immediately cut off all supply lines, completely sealing the population inside. As the weeks dragged into months, the food reserves dwindled. Naturally, the heavily armed garrison and the nobility hoarded whatever grain and salted meat was left in the keeps, leaving the lower classes to fend for themselves in the streets. The resulting desperation was apocalyptic. Trapped citizens were eventually forced to consume the leather of their own shoes, boil the bark from ornamental trees, and hunt down every remaining rat within the city walls. Furthermore, attacking armies frequently utilized a primitive, horrific form of biological warfare to hasten the city's collapse. They would use massive siege engines to catapult the rotting, bloated carcasses of diseased horses and cows, and sometimes even the severed heads of captured prisoners, over the city walls. These decaying projectiles would smash into the crowded streets, instantly contaminating the city's limited water supply and triggering explosive outbreaks of dysentery and plague among the already weakened, starving population locked inside. Even in times of relative peace, the medieval peasant was trapped in a relentless, suffocating web of economic exploitation designed to extract every ounce of their physical energy. Beyond the mandatory tithes paid to the church and the taxes demanded by the crown, serfs were subjected to a brutal system of forced unpaid labor known as corvée. Under this legal obligation, a peasant was forced to abandon their own fragile, dying crops to work on the lord's private estate, plowing his vast fields, repairing his castle walls, or clearing his forests, for several days a week. By the time they were allowed to return to their own meager strips of land, their crops had often rotted from neglect or been devoured by pests. Furthermore, the lords enforced a monopolistic economic system known as the Banalites. A peasant was strictly forbidden from grinding their own grain, baking their own bread, or pressing their own grapes at home. They were legally compelled to use the lord's mill, the lord's massive stone oven, and the lord's wine press, paying exorbitant fees, usually a heavy percentage of their own scarce food, just for the privilege. If a desperate commoner was caught using a hidden handmill in their own hovel to save a handful of flour for their starving children, the lord's bailiffs would smash the millstones to dust and impose crippling financial fines that could plunge the family into inescapable debt for generations. This suffocating desire for control extended beyond human society and bled directly into how medieval people interacted with the natural world, resulting in some of the most bizarre and terrifying legal practices in human history. The medieval mind believed that the universe operated under a strict, divinely ordained moral order, and if that order was disrupted, even by a mindless beast, formal justice had to be served. This led to the surreal and entirely serious phenomenon of animal trials. If a village pig, which roamed freely in the muddy streets eating garbage, mauled an unattended infant, the animal was not simply killed on the spot. Instead, it was formally arrested, locked in the local dungeon alongside human prisoners, and brought to trial in a secular court. The animal was provided a defense attorney, human witnesses were called to testify against it, and a judge would solemnly pass a sentence. The guilty animal would then be publicly hanged or burned at the stake in the town square, sometimes dressed in human clothing, as a bizarre demonstration to the frightened peasants that the divine legal order had been restored. Similarly, if a region was suddenly swarmed by crop-destroying locusts, weevils, or rats, the local bishop would summon the pests to an ecclesiastical court. The insects would be formally ordered to assign a legal representative, and when they inevitably failed to appear in the courtroom, the bishop would formally excommunicate them, officially cursing the swarm in the name of God and ordering them to leave the fields. While this sounds utterly comical to the modern observer, it underscores a deeply tragic psychological reality. Medieval people were so entirely helpless against the brutal, unpredictable, and deadly forces of nature that they had to invent elaborate, theatrical illusions of legal control just to stave off collective madness. Living in the Middle Ages meant existing in a world that was constantly, actively trying to kill you, and doing so while bound by a legal and social system that offered absolutely no empathy for the lower classes. From the suffocating, lung-destroying smoke of the windowless peasant hovel to the blood-soaked cobblestones of the plague-ridden walled cities, human life was the cheapest, most disposable commodity available. To survive a single year required dodging famine, infectious diseases, the brutality of invading armies, the extortion of the ruling class, and the ever-present threat of the inquisitors' tortures. Yet, against all mathematical and biological odds, the peasants pushed forward. They sowed the fields in the freezing rain, they rebuilt their burned villages from the ashes of endless wars, and they passed down the fragile, flickering spark of human existence through the absolute darkest centuries in recorded history. Beyond the immediate physical threats of starvation, disease, and brutal laws, the medieval peasant was trapped in an equally suffocating intellectual prison. The modern mind takes for granted the ability to access information, read a map, or understand basic geography. In the Middle Ages, however, illiteracy was not an exception. It was the overwhelming, mandated rule. The vast majority of the population could neither read nor write a single word, not even their own names. Knowledge was treated as a highly dangerous, exclusive commodity, strictly monopolized by the church and the extreme elite. All written texts, including the Bible and legal documents, were recorded in Latin, a dead language that the common serf did not understand. Consequently, the peasant's entire understanding of the world, of the law, and of God was entirely dependent on what the local priest chose to translate and preach from the pulpit. This intellectual blindness created a society ripe for absolute manipulation. If a corrupt bishop declared that a recent comet was a sign of God's wrath requiring additional financial tithes, or if a lord claimed that a distant war was a holy crusade requiring the village's sons, the peasants had absolutely no intellectual tools to question, debate, or independently verify these claims. They were locked in a dark room, and the ruling class held the only candle. This profound lack of knowledge meant that the average medieval person's physical world was incredibly, almost claustrophobically small. It is estimated that most serfs never traveled more than 10 or 15 miles from the exact spot where they were born. The horizon they saw as children was the exact same horizon they would look at on their deathbeds. Because travel was so dangerous and communication was limited to the speed of a walking man or a galloping horse, news from the outside world was fragmented, unreliable, and often terrifying. If a neighboring kingdom collapsed or a plague broke out in a city just 50 miles away, a village might not find out for months, usually only when desperate, infected refugees suddenly appeared on their muddy roads. This intense isolation bred a culture of deep-seated paranoia and xenophobia. Any outsider, a traveling merchant, a wandering beggar, or a foreigner seeking shelter, was immediately viewed with intense suspicion. In a world where sudden death could arrive on the wind, strangers were frequently assumed to be spies, poisoners, or carriers of divine punishment. This pervasive fear meant that communities were tightly knit but incredibly hostile to the unknown, and mob violence against outsiders could erupt in a matter of minutes based entirely on a fabricated rumor. Adding to the psychological weight of this isolation was the inescapable, agonizing reality of daily, untreated physical pain. While we have discussed the catastrophic failures of medieval medicine in the face of plagues and wounds, the sheer horror of medieval dentistry deserves its own dark chapter. Sugar, as we know it today, was a rare luxury, which meant medieval teeth were somewhat protected from modern cavities. However, the peasant diet relied heavily on coarse, stone-ground bread. The massive millstones used to grind the grain frequently chipped, leaving microscopic shards of stone and grit mixed into the flour. Over the years, chewing this grit literally sanded down the peasant's teeth, exposing the raw nerves and leading to chronic, agonizing dental abscesses. When a tooth became infected, there were no specialized dentists or painkillers. The agonizing task of extraction fell to the local blacksmith or the village barber surgeon. Without any anesthesia, the patient would simply be held down while the barber used heavy, unsterilized iron forceps, often identical to the tools used to pull nails from horseshoes, to violently wrench the rotting tooth from the jaw. The risk of the jawbone splintering or a fatal infection setting into the empty socket was extraordinarily high. Many peasants simply chose to live for years with a dull, throbbing agony in their mouths rather than risk the barber's chair, adding a constant, exhausting layer of physical suffering to every waking hour. Even the simple act of trying to stay warm during the relentless winters carried its own set of deeply tragic, localized dangers. As previously mentioned, the open hearths inside thatched roof homes were massive fire hazards, but the danger extended far beyond a burning house. In the desperate attempt to preserve precious firewood, families would seal every possible draft in their tiny wattle and daub hovels during the deepest freezes. They would stuff rags under the wooden doors and pack mud into any cracks in the walls. While this trapped the heat, It also trapped the invisible, deadly byproduct of the smoldering fire, carbon monoxide. Because the concept of invisible, poisonous gases was entirely unknown, entire families would simply go to sleep huddled around the dying embers of their hearth and never wake up, suffocating silently in the dark. Neighbors would eventually break down the door days later, only to find the family looking perfectly peaceful, completely unaware that the very fire they relied upon for survival had quietly extinguished them. Ultimately, the medieval experience was defined by a profound lack of control. A person's social standing, their health, their legal rights, and even their understanding of the universe were rigidly dictated by forces entirely outside of their influence. You were born into a specific, immovable slot in a brutal hierarchy, and your only true task was to endure. The resilience required to wake up every day, knowing that a single bad harvest, a minor cut, a corrupt lord, or a sudden change in the weather could mean agonizing death, is staggering. The history of the Middle Ages is not just a timeline of kings and battles. It is the ultimate testament to human endurance, a sprawling, dark epic of ordinary people who simply refused to be erased by a world that offered them absolutely no mercy. To fully grasp the inescapable dread of the medieval peasant, one must understand their relationship with the deep, untamed wilderness that surrounded their fragile agricultural clearings. Today we view forests as places of recreation and natural beauty, but to the medieval mind, the greenwood was a place of profound psychological and physical terror. Europe was still heavily blanketed by ancient, dense woodlands that had never been completely mapped or conquered. While the edges of these woods were strictly controlled by the local lords for their private hunting, a monopoly enforced by brutal forest wardens who would unhesitatingly blind or execute a peasant caught poaching a deer, the deeper forest belonged to the predators. During the harshest winters, when the snows grew deep and the wild game died off, massive packs of starving wolves grew incredibly bold. They would routinely stalk the perimeters of isolated villages, snatching unattended livestock, stray dogs, and occasionally children who wandered too far from the hearth. The forest was also the domain of the exiled. Men who had been outlawed by the courts, military deserters, and those fleeing insurmountable debts disappeared into the canopy, surviving as desperate bandits. Thus, the woods that bordered the peasants' fields were a constant, looming threat, a dark wall of trees holding starvation, fangs, and violence, reinforcing the terrified necessity to stay close to the safety of the miserable village mud. Yet, despite the horrors lurking in the trees, the peasant was forced to interact with the fringes of the forest simply to survive the winter. They relied entirely on the woods for foraging acorns for their pigs, gathering fallen branches for firewood, and collecting nuts and berries to stave off the dreaded spring famine. But even the process of protecting oneself from the cold was a grueling year-round labor. The production of clothing in the Middle Ages was not a matter of simply purchasing cloth. It was an intensely physical, multi-step process that consumed nearly all of a peasant woman's limited free time. Making linen, the standard fabric for undergarments, required cultivating flax, pulling it up by the roots, and leaving it to rot in stagnant ponds for weeks. A process called retting, which produced a stench so foul that it was legally banned near town centers. After the stalks rotted, the fibers had to be violently beaten, scraped, and combed until the hands bled, just to yield enough thread to spin on a drop spindle. Wool production was equally exhausting, requiring the shearing, washing, carding, and relentless spinning of raw fleece. Because the process was so incredibly labor-intensive, clothing was profoundly scarce. A typical peasant might own only one or two outfits their entire life. These garments were rarely washed, constantly damp from the harsh climate, and infested with body lice. When the deep freezes of January arrived, there was no concept of a winter coat. Survival simply meant layering every single itchy, ragged piece of clothing you owned over your body and hoping your core temperature didn't drop while you slept. The village community, bound together by these shared miseries, was not a peaceful, pastoral utopia. The intense pressure of communal survival often fractured into bitter, localized resentments. Because the medieval world lacked any organized police force, maintaining order was a terrifyingly collective responsibility known as the hue and cry. If a crime was committed, a theft, an assault, or a murder, the victim or witness was legally obligated to start screaming and raising a massive alarm. Upon hearing the cry, every able-bodied man in the village was legally required to drop their tools, grab whatever pitchfork or club they had, and physically hunt down the perpetrator. If a peasant chose to ignore the cry and stay in their fields, they themselves would be heavily fined by the local court. This system essentially turned every village into an armed, hypervigilant militia. However, in communities where everyone was starving and desperate, this vigilante justice frequently spiraled out of control. Bitter blood feuds over property lines, grazing rights, or stolen firewood could simmer for generations, occasionally exploding into sudden, violent brawls in the muddy streets. You had to rely on your neighbors to survive the harvest, but those same neighbors could instantly turn into a violent mob if a dispute arose over a single sack of grain. Within this tense social ecosystem, certain figures became the focal point of intense, nearly universal hatred. Chief among them was the local miller. As part of the lord's monopoly, peasants were forced to bring all their hard-earned wheat to the lord's mill to be ground into flour, paying a heavy toll for the service. Because the miller controlled the only choke point between the raw harvest and the bread that would keep a family alive through the winter, he wielded terrifying economic power. Millers were universally suspected of extreme corruption, accused of rigging their scales, mixing sawdust or sand into the flour to increase its weight, and secretly siphoning off a portion of the peasants' grain for themselves. While the peasants grew gaunt and their children starved, the miller and his family were often the only commoners in the village who looked well-fed. This deep-seated resentment frequently boiled over into violence, and millers were commonly the first targets of peasant uprisings. To the starving serf, the miller represented the ultimate localized face of a system designed to slowly bleed them dry. This relentless extortion culminated every year in the late summer, during the absolute most critical, nerve-wracking period of the medieval calendar, the harvest. We often romanticize harvest festivals, but the reality was a frantic, physically devastating race against the weather. When the wheat finally ripened, the entire village, men, women, children, the elderly, and even the pregnant, had to mobilize in the fields from before dawn until the last sliver of twilight. The physical toll of swinging heavy scythes and hauling massive sheaves of grain for 16 hours a day, fueled by nothing but watery ale and stale bread, caused widespread physical collapse. But there was no time to rest. The autumn rains were always looming, and a single severe thunderstorm or early frost could flatten the crops and rot the grain directly in the mud. If the village failed to bring the harvest in on time, the entire community would face absolute starvation by February. The psychological pressure was unimaginable. Every swing of the sickle was literally a fight for the right to exist for another 12 months, a desperate, sweaty battle waged by traumatized people who knew that the indifferent sky above them held the power of absolute life and death. Once the frantic, grueling race of the harvest was finally concluded, there was no true period of rest for the medieval peasant. There was only a desperate transition into the next phase of survival. As the brief, golden days of autumn gave way to the encroaching chill of November, the village entered what the Anglo-Saxons grimly referred to as Bultna, or the Blood Month. This was the season of the Great Slaughter. Because the peasants could barely produce enough grain to feed their own families, it was entirely impossible to sustain their livestock through the barren winter months. Any animal that was not absolutely essential for breeding or plowing the following spring had to be killed. The air of the village grew thick with the metallic scent of blood and the smoke of rendering fat. Every single part of the animal was utilized. Intestines were cleaned to make casings for sausages, blood was drained and boiled with oats to create black puddings, and the fat was carefully preserved to make rudimentary, foul-smelling rushlights. The meat itself had to be heavily salted or smoked over the hearth fires. Salt, however, was an incredibly expensive commodity, heavily taxed by the lords and often mixed with impurities. If a peasant could not afford enough salt, or if the salting process was rushed, the meat would inevitably rot in the barrels, leaving the family with a lethal choice come January: eat putrid, maggot-ridden flesh or starve to death. As the deep winter settled over the European continent, the physical isolation of the rural village became absolute. The muddy, rutted roads that connected the scattered settlements completely froze over or became impassable swamps of freezing slush, entirely severing the village from the outside world. 4 months on end, the peasants were locked in a suffocating, frozen stasis. The psychological toll of this extreme isolation, combined with the sensory deprivation of the long, pitch-black nights, was immense. Families were trapped inside their tiny, smoke-filled wattle-and-daub hovels alongside their remaining livestock, listening to the relentless howling of the wind and the terrifyingly bold wolf packs circling just beyond the village boundaries. During these dark months, The peasant diet devolved into a monotonous, highly dangerous routine of rock-hard salted meat, dried peas, and whatever hardened bread was left from the harvest. Because fresh vegetables and fruits were completely non-existent during the winter, a slow, invisible killer began to systematically break down the population's bodies: scurvy. While modern history often associates scurvy strictly with sailors on long ocean voyages, it was a rampant, agonizing reality for landlocked medieval peasants by late February. Their gums would swell and bleed, their teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would miraculously and terrifyingly reopen, and profound lethargy would set in, making even the simplest chore feel like an insurmountable physical mountain. Furthermore, the peasants' already miserable diet was heavily policed by the rigid, inescapable calendar of the medieval church. It is estimated that nearly one-third of the year was designated as mandatory fasting days. The most grueling of these periods was the 40 days of Lent, which coincidentally and cruelly aligned with the late winter and early spring, precisely when the peasants' food stores were at their absolute lowest and their bodies were most vulnerable. During these fasts, the consumption of meat, eggs, cheese and animal fats was strictly forbidden under the threat of severe spiritual damnation and heavy social fines. To survive Lent, peasants were forced to rely on fish. However, for those living far inland, fresh fish was an impossible luxury. Instead, they were forced to consume stockfish, cod or haddock that had been caught in the freezing waters of the North Sea, split open, and dried in the freezing wind until it resembled a plank of wood. This heavily preserved fish was so incredibly hard that it had to be violently beaten with wooden mallets for hours and soaked in water for days just to make it barely chewable. The smell of boiling stockfish, pungent and rotting, permeated every village during the Lenten season, a constant, nauseating reminder of the church's absolute control over the starving stomach of the commoner. When the snows finally began to melt, the arrival of spring was not greeted with joy or poetic celebration. It was the most terrifying and deadly season of the entire medieval year. This period, known ominously as the Hungry Gap, occurred when the winter stores of salted meat and grain had been entirely exhausted, but the new crops planted in the thawing earth were months away from being ready to harvest. April and May were a time of absolute, grinding desperation. The peasants, severely weakened by scurvy, malnutrition, and the suffocating smoke of their winter hovels, were forced back out into the freezing, muddy fields to begin the back-breaking labor of plowing. To fuel this extreme physical exertion, they had to forage for anything remotely edible to trick their empty stomachs. They boiled stinging nettles into a thin, bitter broth, ground up tree bark and acorns to mix with their last handfuls of flour, and scoured the damp forest for edible roots. The mortality rate during the spring months spiked dramatically, particularly among young children and the elderly, whose fragile immune systems simply collapsed under the dual weight of starvation and the sudden, violent spread of waterborne diseases caused by the melting snows flooding the contaminated village wells. It was during this incredibly vulnerable period that the feudal system frequently delivered its most crushing bureaucratic blows. Local lords and tax collectors chose the spring months to collect the tallage, an arbitrary tax that could be levied at any time for any reason, purely at the lord's discretion. If the lord needed to fund a military campaign, pay a ransom, or simply desired to expand his stone castle, he would send his heavily armed bailiffs into the starving villages. The peasants, who had just spent the winter watching their children chew on boiled leather and nettles, were legally forced to hand over whatever meager coins they had hidden away, or surrender their last remaining plow horse. If a family could not pay, they were violently evicted from their ancestral strip of land, their hovel was dismantled or burned, and they were cast out onto the muddy roads to join the swelling ranks of desperate, starving vagabonds. Thus, the medieval peasant lived in a perpetual state of hyperanxiety, knowing that even if they managed to survive the freezing winter, the diseases, and the starvation, a single knock on the door from the lord's tax collector could instantly annihilate their existence. Even if a peasant family miraculously survived the diseases, the crippling taxes, and the agonizing hunger of the spring gap, their meager existence remained terrifyingly vulnerable to the sudden, unpredictable wrath of the elements. In a world constructed almost entirely of dried timber, wattle, and highly combustible straw, the threat of fire was an omnipresent, paralyzing terror. We have already explored the devastating infernos that routinely swallowed overcrowded medieval cities, but a fire in a rural village carried a distinctly different, yet equally lethal, type of catastrophe. A stray spark from a poorly banked hearth, a knocked-over rushlight, or a sudden lightning strike could ignite a thatched roof in seconds. Because houses were built closely together to maximize arable land and share warmth, a single blazing hovel could rapidly escalate into a village-wide conflagration. There was no organized way to fight these fires. The only defense was a desperate, chaotic bucket chain drawing from a sluggish local well. If a peasant's home burned to the ground, they lost everything they owned in a matter of minutes. But the true apocalyptic disaster struck if the village barn caught fire. The barn was the sacred vault of the community, housing the draft animals and, most importantly, the seed grain carefully saved for the next year's planting. If the seed grain burned, the fire did not just destroy a building. It condemned the entire village to absolute starvation the following winter. There was no insurance, no disaster relief from the crown, and no wealthy neighbor willing to give away their own precious seed. The ashes of a barn fire were, quite literally, the ashes of the village's future. Water, too, was a chaotic and deeply feared elemental force. Medieval agriculture was a delicate, fragile mathematical equation, completely dependent on the predictable rhythm of the seasons. A sudden, unseasonal torrential downpour could instantly wash away the newly planted seeds, while severe regional flooding could annihilate months of backbreaking labor overnight. Rivers were the lifeblood of the medieval economy, powering the massive wooden water wheels of the Lord's grain mills. However, when the heavy spring snowmelts combined with fierce rains, these rivers frequently burst their banks with terrifying speed. A violent flood could physically tear the watermill from its stone foundations and send it smashing downstream. Because peasants were legally forbidden from owning their own hand mills, the destruction of the local watermill meant they had absolutely no way to process their harvested wheat into edible flour. They would be forced to travel to a neighboring lord's manor, paying extortionate emergency tolls just to feed their families, instantly plunging them into crippling debt. Furthermore, stagnant floodwaters left in the fields ruined the soil balance, causing root rot and creating vast breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects, ensuring that the misery of the flood lingered long after the waters had receded. Beneath the crushing weight of this relentless elemental, biological, and economic oppression, the psychological tension within the peasantry constantly simmered just below the boiling point. History books often paint the medieval serf as a passive, ignorant beast of burden who simply accepted their miserable fate as God's will. This is a profound misconception. The peasants were acutely, agonizingly aware of the sheer injustice of their existence. They watched the nobility feast on roasted meats and wear fine silks imported from the East, all entirely funded by the sweat, blood, and starvation of the lower classes. When the pressure finally became too immense, usually triggered by a sudden, severe tax hike during a famine year, or the brutal implementation of new draconian labor laws, the peasantry snapped. And when they snapped, the resulting uprisings were not organized political protests. They were explosions of apocalyptic, unrestrained violence. During events like the Jacquerie in France or the Peasants' Revolt in England, the starving masses formed terrifying, desperate armies. Armed with nothing but the tools of their daily torment, sharpened scythes, heavy iron flails, wood axes, and pitchforks, they marched upon the stone fortresses of their oppressors. The targets of their rage were highly specific and deeply symbolic. They hunted down the corrupt tax collectors, the hated local millers, and the wealthy church officials who had extorted their last pennies. Most importantly, when the peasants successfully breached a monastery or a manor house, their first objective was never to steal gold. It was to find the archives and burn the manorial rolls. These parchment documents were the legal chains that bound them to the land, meticulously recording their debts, their serfdom, and their unpaid labor quotas. By burning the records, the peasants believed they were literally burning away their enslavement, attempting to forcefully reset the deeply unfair social order. However, the ruling class's response to these desperate bids for freedom was always characterized by swift, terrifying, and wildly disproportionate brutality. The medieval elite viewed a peasant uprising not as a cry for help from starving subjects, but as a demonic subversion of the natural, God-given hierarchy of the universe. When the professional, heavily armored armies of the nobility finally engaged the peasant mobs, it was a slaughter, not a battle. A starving man in a ragged tunic holding a farming sickle was absolutely no match for a highly trained knight encased in hardened steel plate armor, mounted on a massive warhorse. The uprisings were crushed with a mechanical, merciless efficiency. The aftermath of these rebellions was designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma upon the surviving population. The leaders of the revolts, and often completely innocent bystanders who simply lived in the rebellious regions, were subjected to the most horrific forms of public execution the medieval mind could engineer. They were hung, drawn, and quartered, their severed heads placed on iron spikes above the city gates. The roads leading to the offending villages were lined with makeshift gallows, where the rotting corpses of the rebels were left hanging in iron cages for months, picked clean by crows. These gruesome displays served as a permanent, visceral reminder to the surviving serfs. The mud was their home, the plow was their destiny, and any attempt to challenge the masters of the stone castles would result in a death far worse than the slow starvation they already endured. The peasant was forcefully, violently shoved back into the dark, forced to pick up their blood-stained tools and return to the freezing fields, perfectly aware that the suffocating cycle of medieval survival had merely reset itself once again. Even when the formal wars between rival kings and barons officially ended, the concept of peace was nothing more than a cruel illusion for the medieval peasant. The treaties signed in lavish tents by the nobility meant absolutely nothing to the lower classes, because the end of a formal war birthed a new, highly unpredictable terror: the routiers or the free companies. Throughout the Middle Ages, especially during the protracted conflicts like the 100 Years' War, armies heavily relied on hired mercenaries. When a truce was declared, these kings simply stopped paying their mercenaries and disbanded them in foreign lands. Unemployed, heavily armed, and completely devoid of any moral allegiance, these veteran soldiers banded together to form massive rogue armies that roamed the countryside like organized crime syndicates. Because they had no supply lines, they survived entirely by acting as parasitic entities on the rural population. A free company would descend upon a region, capture a local stone church or a small fortress, and issue a demand for patties, extortionate protection money. If a village refused or simply had nothing left to give, the mercenaries would systematically slaughter the livestock, burn the harvest, and commit unspeakable atrocities against the defenseless inhabitants. The peasant was hopelessly trapped in a vice. If they paid the mercenaries to survive, their own lord would likely execute them for treason and tax evasion. The state offered zero protection against these roaming warlords, leaving the rural population completely at the mercy of hardened killers who viewed them as nothing more than walking currency. While the free companies stripped the peasant of their physical wealth, the corrupt fringes of the religious establishment worked tirelessly to strip them of their final, desperate psychological refuge. We have already established how heavily the medieval mind was weighed down by the terror of purgatory and divine punishment. Recognizing this bottomless well of desperation, a highly lucrative, completely unregulated black market of faith emerged across Europe. The countryside was continuously prowled by traveling salesmen known as pardoners. These men carried forged papal documents and trunks filled with highly dubious religious relics. Splinters claimed to be from the true cross, vials of muddy water sold as the tears of the Virgin Mary, or pig bones passed off as the fingers of martyred saints. For a peasant family watching their child slowly die of a mysterious fever, the desperate need for a miracle overrode all rational thought. They would willingly hand over their last silver coin, their only winter cloak, or a sack of precious seed grain just for the privilege of letting their sick child touch a fake bone. The psychological cruelty of this exploitation was unfathomable. The church hierarchy frequently turned a blind eye to these predatory practices because a portion of the profits inevitably trickled upward to fund the construction of massive, gilded cathedrals. The medieval peasant was effectively bled dry twice, once by the physical taxes of the lord, and once by the weaponized spiritual terror of the con man. If the crushing weight of rural extortion finally drove a desperate serf to abandon their ancestral land and flee to the walled cities, they quickly discovered that the urban landscape offered its own unique circles of hell. For an uneducated, unskilled rural refugee, the only available methods of survival involved performing tasks so incredibly foul and physically destructive that even the poorest city dwellers refused them. One of the most common yet horrific industries for the lowest class was cloth manufacturing, specifically the process of fulling. To remove the natural oils from raw wool and bind the fibers together to make thick winter cloth, the material had to be heavily pounded in highly alkaline liquids. Because industrial chemicals did not exist, the primary source of ammonia was stale human urine. Large barrels were left on street corners for citizens to relieve themselves in, which were then collected and left to putrefy for weeks. The medieval fuller, often a desperate rural migrant, would spend 12 to 14 hours a day standing bare-legged in massive wooden vats filled with this caustic fermented urine, physically trampling the heavy wool. The fumes were so blindingly toxic that fullers frequently suffered from chronic respiratory failure, severe skin infections, and chemical burns on their legs. It was a life of unending, nauseating labor, performed entirely in the shadows of the booming merchant districts. Yet there was a job even lower and vastly more dangerous than the fuller, the gong farmer. Medieval cities, as mentioned, lacked any underground sewage systems. Human waste from thousands of inhabitants fell directly into massive, deep brick-lined cesspits dug beneath the houses and alleyways. When these pits inevitably filled to the brim, the city faced a severe biological crisis. It was the sole responsibility of the gong farmer to empty them. By strict municipal law, this work could only be performed in the dead of night to spare the wealthy citizens the apocalyptic stench. Working by the dim, flickering light of a single tallow candle, these men would lower themselves on fraying ropes deep into the bowels of the suffocating pitch-black pits. They would manually shovel the compacted, rotting waste into wooden buckets to be hauled up, loaded onto handcarts, and dumped outside the city walls. The immediate physical danger of the job was staggering. If a rope snapped, the worker would drown in a sea of filth. However, the true invisible killer was the massive accumulation of methane and hydrogen sulfide gases trapped in the confined space. A sudden pocket of this toxic gas could instantly asphyxiate a worker, causing them to collapse silently into the muck. Alternatively, if their candle ignited a concentrated pocket of methane, the entire cesspit could detonate, causing the street above to collapse. The gong farmer was a vital, indispensable pillar of urban survival, yet they were treated as social untouchables, permanently marked by the smell of their deadly profession, and paid pennies to risk suffocation every single night. This grueling combination of toxic labor, rampant disease, and chronic malnutrition caused the human body to break down at a horrifyingly accelerated rate. The concept of aging in the Middle Ages was vastly different from our modern understanding. Today we consider 50 or 60 to be middle-aged. In the medieval era, a person of 30 who had worked the field since they were 5, survived a dozen famines, and endured the grueling toll of untreated physical trauma was considered culturally and physically old. Their joints were ravaged by severe osteoarthritis, their teeth were either rotted away or entirely worn down to the gums, their eyesight was failing from decades of squinting in dark, smoky hovels, and their spines were permanently bent from carrying impossible burdens. There were no spectacles to correct failing vision, no walking aids beyond a crude wooden stick, and absolutely no remedies for chronic pain. When a peasant's body finally crossed the threshold where they could no longer physically produce more calories than they consumed, they entered the most terrifying phase of medieval life. Unless they had exceptionally devoted adult children who were wealthy enough to spare their own limited food, the elderly were quickly marginalized. They were the first to be fed ground bark during the hungry months, the last to receive warmth by the hearth, and ultimately, the first to succumb to the inevitable winter freezes. The medieval world demanded absolute, continuous physical utility from its inhabitants. The moment that utility faded, society discarded the individual with a brutal, mechanical indifference. Even as the physical body deteriorated under the crushing demands of daily labor, the medieval mind was subjected to an equally relentless mechanism of control, the omnipresent, terrifying machinery of religious orthodoxy and the Inquisition. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as the Church consolidated its absolute power over Europe, any deviation from accepted dogma was no longer just a spiritual failing. It was a capital crime classified as heresy. The medieval peasant lived in a society where independent thought was literally illegal. The Inquisition was not a single, centralized court, but a roaming, localized terror. Inquisitors, often Dominican or Franciscan friars, would arrive in a village and declare a period of grace, urging citizens to step forward and confess their own heretical thoughts or, more devastatingly, to anonymously denounce their neighbors. This system weaponized the bitter, localized resentments of the village that we discussed earlier. A dispute over a stolen pig or a property line could easily escalate into a whispered accusation of witchcraft or heretical sympathies. Once accused, the victim was dragged into a shadow legal system where they had no right to legal counsel, no right to face their accuser, and no presumption of innocence. The torture chambers of the Inquisition, utilizing the rack, the strappado, and water torture, were designed not to discover the truth, but to extract a confession and force the individual to name others, creating a cascading plague of paranoia that could annihilate entire communities. For those whose bodies broke down completely, or who were entirely abandoned by their families in the wake of such purges, the final destination was often the medieval hospital or almshouse. Modern society associates hospitals with sterilization, medicine, and recovery. In the Middle Ages, a hospital was essentially a religious holding pen for the dying. Institutions like the infamous Hôtel Dieu in Paris were not run by doctors, but by monks and nuns whose primary goal was the salvation of the soul, not the healing of the body. The conditions inside these massive, drafty stone halls were a biological nightmare. Because there was no understanding of contagion, beds were incredibly scarce and expensive. It was standard practice for 4 to 6 patients to be forced to share a single, lice-infested straw mattress. A peasant suffering from a broken leg might be placed in the exact same bed as a person actively coughing up blood from tuberculosis, a victim of the plague, and a woman dying of childbed fever. The stench of gangrene, unwashed bodies, and human waste was overpowering, masked only by the heavy burning of frankincense. Medical treatment was virtually non-existent. Instead, the patients were subjected to relentless religious chanting, forced to confess their sins, and expected to endure their agony as a form of spiritual purification. To be sent to a medieval hospital was to cross the threshold of the grave while still drawing breath. If a desperately ambitious individual sought to escape the starvation of the fields and the suffocating control of the local lord by taking to the roads as a traveling merchant or peddler, they traded the stationary horrors of the village for the dynamic, unpredictable violence of the trade routes. The physical infrastructure of medieval Europe was aggressively hostile to movement. The ancient Roman roads had long since collapsed into impassable, muddy trenches. Furthermore, the feudal system turned the landscape into a fractured, extortionate obstacle course. Every few miles, a merchant would cross into a different lord's territory, and at every bridge, river crossing, or mountain pass, they were forced to pay a crippling toll. Some corrupt barons, operating from fortified castles overlooking crucial valleys, essentially functioned as legalized bandits, extorting such massive percentages of a merchant's goods that the journey became entirely unprofitable. If a merchant managed to avoid the robber barons, they still had to survive the journey through the dense, unpoliced wilderness. Caravans were routinely ambushed by the free companies or desperate outlaws. A merchant traveling with a cart of highly valuable salt or woolen cloth was a walking target, and because they carried their entire livelihood on their backs, a single ambush in the dark woods didn't just mean the loss of cargo. It meant instant, total financial ruin and likely a violent death left on the muddy roadside. Moreover, the psychological dominance of the era was not just enforced by the threat of violence or starvation, but by the absolute control over time itself. In the modern world, time is a personal, secular measurement. In the Middle Ages, time belonged exclusively to the church. The average peasant had no concept of hours, minutes, or the specific date. Their entire existence was choreographed by the tolling of the massive bronze bells in the local church tower. The bells dictated when to wake, when to begin working the Lord's fields, when to pause for mandatory prayer, and when to return to the freezing hovel. The most ominous of these was the evening bell, which signaled the couvre-feu, the origin of the modern word curfew, literally meaning cover the fire. When this bell tolled, every fire in the village had to be extinguished or heavily banked to prevent catastrophic infernos, and the population was forced into the suffocating pitch-black silence of the medieval night. This acoustic dominance meant that the peasant was never truly alone. The booming voice of the church echoed across the fields and through the walls of their homes, a constant, ringing reminder of their subjugation and their place at the absolute bottom of the cosmic and social hierarchy. When we synthesize this massive tapestry of suffering, the agonizing lack of medical knowledge, the constant threat of starvation dictated by the weather, the brutal subjugation by the heavily armed nobility, the psychological terror of the Inquisition, the biological nightmare of the cities, and the absolute vulnerability to both nature and human cruelty, the true magnitude of medieval survival becomes clear. The era was a massive, centuries-long meat grinder that processed human lives with mechanical indifference. There was no romance in the mud. There was only the raw, desperate, and astonishingly resilient human will to endure. The peasants, the serfs, the vagabonds, and the laborers who navigated this abyss did not write the history books, and their names are entirely lost to time. Yet, it was their calloused hands, their unbroken backs, and their quiet, staggering ability to survive the darkest chapter of human history that eventually dragged civilization out of the mud and laid the absolute foundations for the modern world we sit in today. While it might seem that the narrative of medieval suffering has reached its absolute limits, diving deeper into the mundane, everyday aspects of this era reveals that even the rare moments of supposed joy or routine farm work were laced with lethal hazards. We often assume that the grueling labor of the peasantry must have been balanced by vibrant, joyous festivals and communal celebrations. However, the reality of medieval leisure was deeply intertwined with the same brutal violence that characterized the rest of their existence. Because the peasant population lived under constant, crushing psychological pressure, physical exhaustion, and strict religious suppression, their rare holidays often exploded into chaotic, deadly spectacles. Take, for example, the medieval precursor to modern sports, mob football. Played typically on Shrove Tuesday before the agonizing fast of Lent began, this was not a regulated game played on a manicured pitch. It was an unrestrained, ultra-violent brawl between two rival villages. The ball was usually an inflated pig's bladder encased in leather, and the goals were often the respective churches of the two villages, which could be several miles apart. There were absolutely no rules against punching, kicking, biting, or gouging. Hundreds of desperate, intoxicated men would swarm the fields, trampling crops, smashing through fences, and fighting tooth and nail in the freezing mud. Historical coroners' rolls are littered with the gruesome aftermath of these holidays. Men who had their backs broken in the crush, individuals who drowned after being pinned face down in shallow creeks, and countless others who succumbed to fatal stab wounds when hidden daggers were drawn in the heat of the melee. What was meant to be a brief psychological release before a period of starvation frequently ended in localized mass casualty events, proving that even in their attempts at recreation, the medieval peasantry could not escape the shadow of death. Beyond the violence of their festivals, the simple, quiet act of working the land harbored its own constant, silent dangers. We tend to romanticize the pastoral image of the medieval farm, picturing docile sheep and gentle cows. In reality, medieval livestock were vastly different from the highly domesticated, genetically bred animals we know today. They were significantly smaller, but they were also half-wild, aggressive, and incredibly dangerous. The draft animals, the oxen and heavy horses required to pull the massive wooden plows through heavy, wet clay, were engines of pure, volatile muscle. In a world devoid of modern machinery, humans lived in terrifyingly close proximity to these beasts. A sudden loud noise, a snake in the grass, or a stinging horsefly could cause a draft horse to violently spook. A single kick to a peasant's chest or a crushing blow to the skull from a panicked ox was instantly fatal. Furthermore, if a peasant suffered a compound fracture, a common occurrence when heavy, wooden, iron-rimmed carts overturned on deeply rutted muddy roads, there was no orthopedic surgery. The exposed bone would immediately become infected with the ubiquitous bacteria of the farmyard. The victim would be carried to their dark hovel, where they would endure days of screaming, feverish agony as gangrene set in, slowly creeping up their limb until the infection reached their heart. The historical records are filled with these deeply mundane yet utterly tragic accidents. Men crushed beneath falling trees while foraging for winter wood, women fatally gored by aggressive boars while trying to feed them, and children kicked to death by mules in the very barns meant to shelter them. The farm was not a sanctuary, it was an industrial accident waiting to happen, armed with hooves and horns. This ever-present peril extended far beyond the muddy fields and into the treacherous, unpredictable domain of water. We previously discussed the dangers of flooded rivers, but for those who had to navigate the open seas or vast lakes, the medieval world became infinitely more terrifying. Seafaring in the Middle Ages was essentially a blind gamble with the abyss. The ships of the era, such as the single-masted cog, were clunky, deep-bellied wooden vessels primarily held together by iron nails and a precarious ceiling of tar and animal hair. They were incredibly difficult to maneuver and sailed poorly against the wind. More importantly, navigational technology was virtually non-existent for the common sailor. The magnetic compass was a rare, late medieval introduction, and concepts like longitude were centuries away from being understood. Sailors relied entirely on dead reckoning, the position of the stars, and the color of the water to guess their location. If a sudden violent squall blew a ship off its coastal course and thick fog rolled in, the crew was instantly hopelessly lost in a vast, gray void. The conditions below the deck of a medieval ship were a concentrated nightmare of the era's worst torments. Sailors lived in absolute, crushing darkness, crammed into tiny, unventilated wooden hulls that perpetually leaked freezing seawater. The bilge water at the bottom of the ship was a toxic, putrid soup of rotting grain, dead rats, and human waste, generating a stench so foul it could induce constant vomiting. Because fires could not be safely lit on a wooden ship tossing in the waves, the crew subsisted entirely on the same rock-hard, heavily salted tack and putrid water that plagued the wintering peasants, leading to rapid outbreaks of scurvy and dysentery in the middle of the ocean. However, the ultimate terror of medieval seafaring was the deep, psychological dread of the water itself. In the Middle Ages, almost nobody knew how to swim. Swimming was not considered a recreational activity, and for the peasantry who viewed rivers primarily as industrial power sources or open sewers, entering deep water was completely unnatural. If a medieval ship struck a hidden reef or was swamped by a rogue wave, the crew's fate was sealed the moment the timber cracked. Weighed down by heavy layers of saturated wool and leather, a sailor cast into the freezing ocean would sink like a stone. Furthermore, the medieval mind populated the uncharted oceans with horrifying biblical sea monsters, massive krakens, leviathans, and demonic sirens. To drown in the Middle Ages was not just to die, it was to be swallowed by the chaotic, unholy abyss, a realm entirely forsaken by God. The ocean was a vast, watery graveyard, and every merchant or sailor who stepped onto a gangplank knew they were placing their lives entirely in the hands of the unpredictable winds. Even back on dry land, the sheer unpredictability of the environment continually mocked the peasants' desperate attempts at stability. We must consider the catastrophic impact of the localized wildlife on the delicate food supply. Before the advent of modern pesticides or enclosed grain silos, a village's entire winter reserve was essentially an open buffet for the vermin of the forest. A sudden population explosion of field mice or black rats could hollow out a village's granary in a matter of weeks, leaving the community to discover, too late, that their massive sacks of wheat had been turned to dust and droppings. Birds too were a relentless enemy. Massive flocks of crows and starlings would descend upon the fields just as the seeds were germinating. It was the sole desperate job of the youngest children, armed only with wooden clappers and their own exhausted voices, to stand in the freezing rain from dawn to dusk, screaming and throwing stones to protect the fragile green shoots from being devoured from the sky. If the children failed or simply fell asleep from exhaustion, the crop was decimated before it even had a chance to grow. Thus, we see that the true horror of the Middle Ages was not just contained in the dramatic, sweeping events like the Black Death or the brutal Crusades. It was woven into the very fabric of everyday existence. It was the pig bladder that caused a fatal crush, the spooked horse in the muddy furrow, the rotting wood of the merchant ship, and the rats chewing through the darkness of the granary. The medieval peasant was constantly fighting a multi-front war for survival against the weather, the animals, the nobility, the church, and the very microscopic bacteria covering their own hands. Every single day was an exercise in extreme hazard mitigation, where the penalty for a moment of distraction or a stroke of bad luck was immediate, agonizing death. To understand the psychological landscape of the medieval peasant, one must realize that their world was not merely haunted by visible enemies like corrupt lords and invading armies, but by a dense, invisible framework of terrifying folklore that directly influenced how they treated their own families. In an era devoid of psychological understanding, genetics, or developmental science, severe childhood illnesses, congenital disabilities, or conditions like autism were not viewed as medical realities. Instead, they were explained through the deeply sinister lens of the changeling myth. Communities firmly believed that malicious fairies or demons would sneak into human hovels at night, steal a healthy human infant, and leave behind a sickly, ravenous, or nonverbal supernatural proxy. This superstition transformed parental grief and confusion into active, defensive terror. To force the fairies to return the true human child, parents would subject the suspected changeling infant to agonizing trials ordained by local folklore. These babies were often left exposed on lonely hillsides overnight, beaten with stinging nettles, or held close to the roaring flames of the open hearth. If the child died from this extreme neglect or trauma, as they frequently did, it was not viewed as a tragedy or a crime, but as definitive proof that the entity was indeed a demon that had simply fled back to the underworld. This tragic intersection of ignorance and superstition meant that the most vulnerable members of medieval society, children born with specialized needs or chronic illnesses, were viewed as supernatural threats to the village's survival, adding a profoundly dark psychological trauma to the already fragile fabric of domestic life. If a peasant sought to escape the relentless cycle of agricultural failure by apprenticing in one of the highly necessary artisan trades of the era, they merely traded the hazards of the plow for the slow, chemical poisoning of early medieval industry. The production of everyday items required processes that were aggressively toxic and environmentally destructive. Consider the trade of the tanner, responsible for turning raw animal hides into the leather needed for shoes, saddles, and armor. Tanning workshops were intentionally relegated to the absolute margins of towns due to the overwhelming, nauseating stench of decay. The process began by soaking the skins in massive vats of human urine to strip away the hair, followed by manually scraping off the rotting flesh and fat. To soften the stiff leather, tanners would then spend hours manually kneading the hides in pits filled with a warm mixture of water and dog feces, utilizing the natural enzymes of the waste. Tanners lived in a state of permanent biological contamination, suffering from chronic bacterial infections, chemical blindness, and respiratory tracts entirely scorched by the ammonia fumes, making them social outcasts who literally carried the stench of rot to their early graves. Similarly, the medieval textile dye industry was an unspoken matrix of heavy metal poisoning. To make vibrant colors stick to wool or linen, dyers had to utilize fixatives known as mordants. The most common of these were alum, iron sulfate, and copperas. Laborers spent their entire lives breathing in the dust of these minerals and stirring massive, boiling cauldrons of toxic chemical cocktails with bare arms. The constant exposure to heavy metals led to progressive neurological decay, severe tremors, chronic organ failure, and a complete breakdown of the nervous system long before the worker reached what we would consider middle age. Even the humble village blacksmith, romanticized as a symbol of rural strength, labored in an environment of continuous physical destruction. Standing before a roaring coal forge for 16 hours a day without any respiratory protection meant inhaling massive quantities of toxic sulfur dioxide gas and microscopic carbon dust. Blacksmiths frequently suffered from severe, irreversible lung disease, permanent hearing loss from the relentless clanging of iron on the anvil, and premature cataracts caused by staring directly into the intense infrared radiation of the burning coals. Beyond the chemical traps of the workshops, the internal biology of the medieval population was a battleground for an invisible war of rampant parasitism. Due to the complete absence of food safety regulations, water filtration, or basic hand hygiene, virtually every single human being in the Middle Ages, from the lowest serf to the king sitting upon the throne, was host to a massive, thriving colony of internal parasites. The standard practice of using human and animal manure to fertilize agricultural fields meant that parasite eggs contaminated the very vegetables and grains the peasants consumed. Tapeworms, roundworms, and liver flukes were an inescapable reality of daily life. These internal parasites lived in a state of permanent competition with the human host for nutrients. A peasant might consume a hard-earned bowl of barley pottage, but a significant portion of that meager caloric intake was instantly siphoned off by worms multiplying in their digestive tract. This constant, internal drain on nutrition explains why medieval populations were perpetually fatigued, anemic, and physically depleted, leaving their immune systems entirely defenseless when larger, more aggressive pathogens like typhus or the plague arrived to finish them off. Finally, we must consider the absolute vulnerability of the medieval economy to a crime that threatened the very survival of the monetary system: coin clipping. In an era before milled edges or paper currency, silver and gold coins were minted by hand, resulting in irregular, uneven shapes. Desperate individuals, from impoverished merchants to corrupt clerics, realized they could subtly shave or clip microscopic slivers of precious metal from the rough edges of the coins before passing them along at full face value. Once enough silver shavings were accumulated, they could be melted down to create counterfeit coins or sold on the black market. While this sounds like a victimless financial crime, its real-world consequences for the peasantry were catastrophic. As clipped and debased currency flooded the markets, massive inflation would instantly trigger a sudden explosion in the price of basic necessities like salt and grain. A peasant who had spent an entire year saving a few precious silver coins to pay their lord's taxes would suddenly find their money deemed worthless by the tax collectors, who used precise scales to weigh the currency rather than accepting it at face value. Unable to pay due to a financial fraud they couldn't possibly understand or detect, entire families were violently stripped of their lands and cast into the freezing winter mud, victims of an invisible economic vice that was just as lethal as a failed harvest or a mercenary raid. To fully comprehend the baseline of physical misery that a medieval person had to endure, one must look at the literal foundation of their daily movement: their footwear. While popular culture often depicts people of this era wearing sturdy, well-crafted leather boots, the reality for the common peasant was a continuous battle against the damp earth with almost zero protection. Leather was an incredibly expensive, heavily taxed commodity. Most serfs wore turn shoes, primitive, thin slippers made from a single piece of leather stitched inside out, offering no ankle support, no traction, and absolutely no insulation from the frozen ground. For the poorest laborers, even these were an unattainable luxury. They wrapped their feet in coarse rags, stuffed them with dry straw, and wedged them into heavy, carved wooden clogs. During the relentless autumn rains and winter thaws, these rudimentary shoes were instantly saturated with freezing, bacteria-laden mud and animal waste from the fields. Because a peasant owned only one pair of shoes that could take weeks to dry near a smoky hearth, they spent months working with permanently wet, freezing feet. This chronic exposure triggered rampant outbreaks of what we now recognize as trench foot and severe frostbite. The skin on their feet would blister, decay, and turn black. Because there was no understanding of circulation or sterile wound care, these localized tissue deaths frequently turned into dry gangrene. A peasant would simply have to endure the slow, agonizing loss of their toes or sections of their feet, continuing to limp out into the fields every morning because missing a single day of labor meant the Lord's bailiffs would seize their meager food rations. If a commoner was forced to travel beyond their village for a mandatory pilgrimage or to transport goods to a distant market, the question of where to sleep at night presented a terrifying logistical gauntlet. The concept of a private, secure hotel room did not exist for the lower classes. Travelers had to rely on roadside taverns or monastic hospices, environments that were concentrated breeding grounds for crime and disease. In a typical medieval inn, guests did not purchase a room, they purchased a space in a communal bed. It was standard practice for 4, 5, or even 6 complete strangers, ranging from traveling peddlers and desperate laborers to soldiers deserting their regiments, to be crammed side by side onto a single filthy straw mattress. This forced intimacy was extraordinarily dangerous. As you slept from sheer exhaustion, you were entirely vulnerable to the strangers beside you, who could easily slit your throat or steal your meager life savings from your pouch in the absolute darkness of the unlit room. Furthermore, these communal beds were heavily infested with body lice, bedbugs, and fleas that had jumped off previous, infected occupants. A single night spent in a roadside inn was often the exact moment a healthy traveler contracted typhus or the plague, turning what was supposed to be a journey of economic necessity or spiritual devotion into a literal death sentence. The systemic cruelty of the medieval structure was so absolute that it did not even allow a family to grieve the loss of a loved one without facing immediate, state-sanctioned financial ruin. When the male head of a peasant household inevitably succumbed to injury, exhaustion, or disease, the family was immediately hit by a devastating legal extortion known as the heriot or the death duty. Under feudal law, the local lord technically owned everything on the land, including the peasants themselves. Therefore, upon the death of a serf, the lord had the legal right to seize the family's absolute best asset, which was almost always their primary draft ox or their healthiest milk cow, as a tax to allow the surviving son to inherit the right to continue working the land. To compound this tragedy, the local parish priest would then arrive to claim the mortuary fee, a separate religious tax that legally entitled the church to the family's second best asset, such as their second healthiest animal, their only metal cooking cauldron, or the bed the patriarch had just died in. Within days of losing their primary provider, a grieving widow and her children were systematically stripped of the very tools and livestock required to farm and feed themselves. This legalized plundering ensured that poverty was cyclical and inescapable. A single death in the family could instantly downgrade a stable serf household into a starving, landless group of beggars forced onto the dangerous roads. This complete lack of security was reinforced by a profound, universal isolation from information that made it impossible for a peasant to even track the progression of their own life. Because there were no birth certificates, census records, or accessible calendars for the lower classes, the vast majority of medieval peasants had absolutely no idea how old they were. Age was not measured in numerical years, but through the hazy lens of memory and cataclysmic local events. If a magistrate asked a peasant their age during a legal dispute, the serf would typically respond with phrases like, "I was a boy when the great frost turned the river to ice," or "I was married during the summer the red plague took the livestock." They existed in a perpetual floating present, unable to read a map, understand the concept of nations, or comprehend what lay beyond the nearest ridge of hills. This total informational vacuum left the population completely untethered, entirely dependent on the ruling class to interpret the passage of time, the laws of the land, and the will of the heavens. They were cogs in a massive, indifferent machine, navigating a world of absolute physical hardship and psychological darkness, where survival was not a baseline expectation, but a temporary, miraculous reprieve from the grave. The domestic sphere, primarily managed by peasant women, was far from a safe haven. Instead, it was an arena of continuous, chemically hazardous labor that slowly eroded the human body. One of the most physically destructive and reviled domestic chores was the production of soap and the washing of clothes. Because commercial cleaning agents did not exist, medieval women had to manufacture their own cleaning solutions using highly volatile, natural ingredients. To create lye soap, they would collect wood ash from the central hearth, place it in a barrel, and repeatedly pour water over it to leach out a highly concentrated, alkaline liquid known as potash. This crude lye was then boiled in massive iron cauldrons with rancid animal fat or tallow. The resulting mixture was extraordinarily caustic. Without any protective gear, women routinely suffered severe chemical burns on their hands and arms, leading to chronic, weeping ulcers that were highly susceptible to deadly bacterial infections. When the time came to wash the family's heavy, sweat-soaked woolen garments, the process required brute physical strength. In the dead of winter, women had to carry these heavy loads to the nearest freezing river or stream, kneeling on the icy banks for hours to violently beat the cloth against flat stones to loosen the dirt. The combination of freezing water, caustic lye soap, and repetitive, back-breaking motion caused rampant, premature osteoarthritis in the hands and wrists, alongside chronic hypothermia and severe skin fissures that bled constantly, turning a basic act of hygiene into a torturous trial of physical endurance. The natural environment presented further psychological horrors through the legal weaponization of the wilderness itself. Under medieval law, the ultimate punishment short of execution was to be declared an outlaw, or legally designated as a caput lupinum, literally meaning a wolf's head. If a peasant fled into the deep forest to escape a corrupt lord, an insurmountable tax, or an accusation of a crime, they were stripped of all human rights and legally equated to a wild, predatory beast. Being declared a wolf's head meant that the individual was entirely outside the protection of the law. Anyone who encountered them in the wilderness could hunt them down, decapitate them, and bring their head to the local magistrate to collect a financial bounty, with absolutely no legal repercussions. The psychological terror of this status was absolute. The outlaw lived in a state of permanent, waking paranoia, unable to trust a single human being, sleeping in hollow trees or damp caves, constantly hunted by bounty seekers, rival bandits, and actual wolf packs. To be cast out of the social and spiritual shield of the medieval community was a psychological death sentence, a forced descent into a savage, animalistic existence where the environment itself was actively transformed into a state-sanctioned executioner. This profound vulnerability to the environment was heavily compounded by a structural scarcity of basic heating fuel that turned the winter months into a quiet, freezing apocalypse inside the hovels. While modern imagery often depicts medieval homes with roaring, cozy log fires, the reality for the common serf was one of severe fuel deprivation. The vast, dense forests that surrounded the villages were the private property of the nobility, and the laws regarding vert and venison, the vegetation and the animals of the forest, were fiercely, violently enforced. A peasant caught chopping down a living tree for firewood faced immediate public mutilation, such as the loss of a hand, or summary hanging by the lord's foresters. The lower classes were legally restricted to fireboat, the right to gather only fallen, dead branches that could be reached by hook or by crook, using a shepherd's crook or a harvesting hook to pull down dead wood. During long, exceptionally severe winters, the dead wood on the forest floor was quickly exhausted. Desperate families were forced to burn dried animal dung, damp peat, or decayed straw inside their unventilated, windowless homes. This fuel produced a heavy, thick, suffocating smoke that didn't just sting the eyes. It filled the living space with highly concentrated carbon monoxide and toxic particulates, causing widespread respiratory failure, permanent blindness, and chronic lung rot among children and the elderly who were forced to sit directly in the smog just to keep their limbs from freezing solid. When the combination of physical torment, structural oppression, and chronic malnutrition became too immense for the human psyche to bear, the medieval population occasionally fell victim to terrifying, collective psychological breakdowns that manifested as mass psychogenic illnesses. One of the most bizarre and deeply tragic phenomena of the era was the dancing plague, or choreomania, which sporadically erupted across Europe. Suddenly, and without any warning, a single individual would begin to dance erratically, twitching and screaming in the village center. Within hours, dozens of neighboring peasants, overwhelmed by a contagious, hysterical frenzy, would join in, completely unable to stop their bodies from moving. Because medieval society lacked any concept of mental health crises or collective psychological trauma, the church and local authorities believed the dancers were either possessed by demons or cursed by Saint Vitus. The treatment was profoundly counterproductive. Believing the victims simply needed to dance the sickness out of their systems, towns would hire musicians to keep playing and clear out the market squares to give them room. Hundreds of peasants would dance continuously for days or even weeks, in a state of complete delirium. Their feet would blister and tear, their bones would fracture under the continuous strain, and they would ultimately collapse into the dust, dying of sheer physical exhaustion, severe dehydration, or sudden heart failure. These bizarre outbreaks were the visceral, outward projections of a society driven completely insane by the inescapable, crushing horror of their daily reality, collective scream of agony from a population that had reached the absolute limits of human endurance. To answer exactly why the medieval mind and body suddenly snapped into these bizarre, fatal dancing frenzies, modern historians, psychologists, and toxicologists point to a catastrophic collision of biological poisoning, unrelenting psychological trauma, and deep-seated religious hysteria. The dancing plague was not a single, easily explained phenomenon, but rather the explosive symptom of a society that was rotting from the inside out. The most prominent biological explanation for these outbreaks lies in the very food the peasants relied upon to survive: rye bread. During the particularly damp, cold spring seasons that frequently plagued medieval Europe, the rye crops became heavily infected with a toxic fungus known as Claviceps purpurea or ergot. This invisible fungus contains psychoactive alkaloids, most notably ergotamine, which is a direct chemical precursor to modern LSD. Because the starving peasants could not afford to throw away contaminated grain, they baked the dark, fungal flour into their daily bread. When an entire village unknowingly consumed this ergot-tainted bread, they suffered from acute mass poisoning known as ergotism. The physical effects of ergotism were terrifying: severe restriction of blood vessels leading to gangrene, an excruciating burning sensation beneath the skin historically called St. Anthony's fire, and profound, violent hallucinations. The victims' nervous systems would completely misfire, causing uncontrollable muscle spasms, severe tremors, and erratic thrashing that, to a terrified, uneducated observer, looked exactly like a demonic, rhythmic dance. The peasants were not dancing; they were experiencing severe neurotoxic convulsions while trapped in a collective, drug-induced nightmare. However, biological poisoning alone does not explain outbreaks that lasted for weeks or spread across vast regions. This brings us to the psychological trigger: stress-induced mass hysteria. As we have established, the medieval peasant lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing hypervigilance. They were trapped in a vice of starvation, crushing feudal taxation, the constant grief of losing children to disease, and the terrifying, omnipresent threat of divine punishment. The human brain is simply not equipped to process decades of uninterrupted, severe trauma without a release valve. When the psychological pressure became completely unbearable, it triggered a massive dissociative state. If one highly stressed, exhausted individual snapped and began to thrash or dance hysterically in the village square, the overwhelming suggestibility and shared trauma of the community acted like a psychological contagion. Neighbors, already hovering on the brink of complete mental collapse, unconsciously mirrored the behavior, entering a deeply trance-like, dissociative state to completely detach themselves from the unbearable agony of their reality. The dancing was an involuntary, desperate psychological retreat from a world that offered them absolutely no mercy, no comfort, and no hope. Finally, this biological and psychological perfect storm was ignited by the rigid religious folklore of the era. The medieval mind could only process the universe through the lens of divine wrath or demonic intervention. There was a widespread, terrifying superstition that specific saints, particularly Saint Vitus or Saint John, had the power to curse sinners with an unstoppable dancing mania. When peasants began to experience the spasms of ergot poisoning or the dissociative fugue of extreme trauma, they genuinely believed they had been cursed by heaven. In a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy, they believed the only way to appease the furious saint and break the curse was to literally dance until the sin was physically sweated out of their bodies. They surrendered entirely to the hysteria, moving with frantic, terrified devotion. It was a deadly cycle. The more they danced, the more exhausted and delirious they became, and the more the surrounding community believed the curse was real, drawing even more victims into the fatal frenzy. Ultimately, the question of why they danced is answered by the sheer weight of the medieval era itself. Their food poisoned them, their trauma broke their minds, and their religion convinced them they were damned, leaving them no choice but to dance themselves to death in the muddy, freezing streets. Would you like to continue by exploring the grim realities of medieval justice and the terrifying trials by ordeal, or should we delve into the brutal, unsanitary world of medieval surgery and the barber surgeons? If the invisible horrors of poisoned grain, psychological collapse, and rampant disease were not enough to break the medieval spirit, the tangible, iron-fisted reality of the justice system ensured that fear remained a constant companion. In a world devoid of forensic science, impartial juries, or the concept of reasonable doubt, the law was not a shield for the innocent. It was a bludgeon wielded by the elite to maintain absolute order through theatrical terror. When a crime was committed, whether a stolen sack of flour or a whispered treason, the process of determining guilt was a descent into a nightmare of physical agony known as the trial by ordeal. Because the medieval mind operated on the absolute certainty that God was actively involved in every mundane aspect of earthly life, magistrates believed that divine intervention was the only foolproof method for determining innocence. If a peasant was accused of a crime and could not produce a sufficient number of oath-helpers, wealthy or respected men willing to swear to their innocence, they were subjected to the ordeal of fire or the ordeal of water. In the ordeal of fire, the terrified accused was forced to attend a solemn mass before being led to the church courtyard. There, the local priest would bless a heavy block of solid iron that had been heating in a roaring forge until it glowed a blinding, translucent orange. The accused was forced to pick up this blistering iron with their bare hands and carry it a specific distance, usually 9 paces. Their severely burned, blackened hands were then heavily bandaged and sealed by the priest. 3 days later, the bandages were removed in front of the community. If the horrific burn was healing cleanly, it was declared a miracle and the accused was deemed innocent by God. If the wound was festering, putrid, and infected, which was the absolute biological certainty in an era with zero understanding of sterile environments, the infection was taken as undeniable divine proof of guilt. The peasant would then be dragged directly from the church courtyard to the gallows. The ordeal of water was equally terrifying, particularly for women accused of witchcraft or infanticide. The accused was violently bound, their right thumb tied to their left toe, and their left thumb to their right toe, forcing them into a rigid, unnatural fetal position. They were then thrown into a deep, consecrated river or pond. The twisted logic of the era dictated that because water was the pure element used in holy baptism, it would physically reject a sinner. If the bound victim miraculously managed to float, they were declared guilty and immediately executed. If they sank like a stone, the water was accepting them, proving their innocence. While they were ostensibly proven innocent, the sheer weight of their saturated woolen clothing and the inability to swim meant that many innocent victims simply drowned before they could be hauled back to the muddy surface. Even if one managed to avoid the lethal spectacle of the ordeals, falling into the hands of a medieval jailer was a slow, suffocating doom. Prisons were not designed for rehabilitation, nor were they meant to hold criminals for long sentences. They were merely holding pens where the accused waited for their execution or the arrival of a traveling judge. These dungeons, often located deep beneath the stone foundations of the local keep, were known as oubliettes, derived from the French word meaning to forget. A prisoner was literally dropped through a trapdoor in the ceiling into a pitch-black, freezing, bottle-shaped hole in the earth. There were no beds, no latrines, and no light. The floor was perpetually flooded with freezing, stagnant water and infested with aggressive brown rats. Because the state provided absolutely no food or water, a prisoner entirely forgotten by their family, or whose family simply could not afford to bribe the guards, would slowly starve to death in absolute darkness, their final days spent screaming into a stone abyss that absorbed every sound. When the heavy hand of the law or the crushing accidents of the agricultural fields inevitably shattered a peasant's body, they were forced into the hands of the most feared figure in the village, the barber surgeon. The separation between intellectual medicine and physical surgery in the Middle Ages was profound. University-trained physicians, clothed in rich velvets, considered it entirely beneath their dignity to physically cut human flesh or touch blood. They merely diagnosed ailments by observing the stars or inspecting the color of a patient's urine. The actual, bloody work of surgery was left to the barbers, who possessed the sharpest razors in the village. The barber surgeon's workshop was a place of unimaginable trauma, identifiable by a red and white striped pole outside the door, the red symbolizing blood, the white symbolizing bandages, and the pole itself representing the stick a patient would squeeze in agony to make their veins bulge. If a peasant suffered a crushed limb beneath a heavy cartwheel or developed a gangrenous infection from a farming accident, amputation was the only known cure. There was absolutely no anesthesia. The patient was held down by 4 strong men on a blood-soaked wooden table. The barber surgeon would offer the victim a piece of leather or a block of wood to bite down on to prevent them from biting off their own tongue. Using a heavy, unsterilized woodworker's saw, the barber would violently hack through the muscle and bone as quickly as possible while the patient remained entirely conscious. Because there were no modern clamps or stitches to stop the massive arterial bleeding, the surgeon would immediately plunge the raw, severed stump into a cauldron of boiling pitch or press a red-hot branding iron directly against the exposed flesh to cauterize the wound. The sheer shock of the agonizing pain, combined with the catastrophic blood loss, frequently triggered massive cardiac arrest, killing the patient on the table. If they somehow survived the brutal butchery, the unwashed tools and the filthy environment guaranteed that a lethal post-operative infection would soon take hold. The medieval body was constantly invaded, broken, and tortured by the very environment and institutions that were supposed to sustain it, leaving the peasantry to navigate a world where a swift, quiet death was often considered the ultimate, unattainable luxury. The machinery of the feudal state did not only extract a peasant's labor and wealth, it ultimately demanded their physical body to feed the endless, grinding engines of medieval warfare. We have touched upon the devastation of the chevauchee and the roaming mercenary bands, but the terror was magnified tenfold when a common serf was actively conscripted to stand on the battlefield. When a regional conflict escalated, the nobility relied on the levy en masse, a mandatory conscription of the untrained peasant population. A man could be pulled directly from his muddy plow, handed a cheaply forged spear or simply told to bring his own modified agricultural flail, and forced to march hundreds of miles from his home into a conflict he did not understand. For these conscripted men, the medieval battlefield was an environment of incomprehensible sensory overload and sheer, paralyzing terror. They were not outfitted in the gleaming steel plate armor of the nobility, they marched in their everyday woolen tunics, offering absolutely no protection against arrows, lances, or heavy swords. In the strategic hierarchy of medieval combat, the peasant infantry was considered entirely disposable. Their primary function was to act as human shields, placed at the front lines to absorb the initial, devastating volleys of enemy longbows or crossbows, effectively exhausting the enemy's ammunition before the valuable, aristocratic cavalry charged. To stand in a tightly packed shield wall as a peasant was to endure a psychological nightmare. As the enemy archers released their strings, the sky would physically darken. The sound of thousands of arrows descending simultaneously was often described by chroniclers as the terrifying tearing of massive sheets of canvas. When the arrows struck, the carnage was instantaneous and chaotic. But the true, primal dread arrived with the cavalry charge. Imagine a starving, exhausted farmer armed with a wooden pitchfork, forced to hold his ground against a line of massive, heavily armored war horses charging at full gallop, ridden by knights who had trained for slaughter since childhood. The sheer kinetic impact of a medieval cavalry charge against an unarmored infantry line was devastating, physically shattering the peasant ranks and trampling hundreds beneath iron-shod hooves into the blood-soaked mud. If a peasant miraculously survived the chaotic hours-long melee of the battlefield, they quickly discovered that the most efficient killer in a medieval army was not the sword, but the war camp itself. As thousands of men and horses congregated in muddy, unsanitary fields, The local water sources were instantly contaminated with human and animal waste. The medieval military camp was a sprawling, apocalyptic slum of canvas and mud, plagued by unimaginable biological hazards. Camp fever, what modern medicine recognizes as epidemic typhus, spread by the millions of body lice infesting the soldiers' unwashed clothing, swept through the ranks with terrifying speed. Alongside typhus was the ever-present specter of the bloody flux, or severe dysentery. Armies were frequently decimated not by enemy action, but by catastrophic outbreaks of bacterial infections that caused severe, fatal dehydration. Soldiers were so weakened by disease that entire campaigns had to be abandoned because the men were physically incapable of lifting their weapons or standing up from the latrine trenches. The mortality rate from disease in these camps vastly outnumbered the casualties of actual combat, turning the supposed glory of military service into a squalid, agonizing death in a freezing, feces-filled ditch miles away from home. When the armies finally moved on, they left behind a landscape that had been fundamentally altered by death. The aftermath of a medieval battle was a grim, highly organized theater of scavenging. Because poverty was absolute, the bodies of the fallen were not respected. They were viewed as a sudden vital source of resources. Local villagers, known as camp followers or looters, would swarm the battlefield under the cover of darkness. They systematically stripped the dead and the dying of everything valuable: leather boots, wool cloaks, rusted daggers, and even the iron buckles from their belts. The dead were left completely naked in the mud, eventually to be hastily tossed into massive, unmarked mass graves by the exhausted victors, ensuring that thousands of men simply vanished from history, leaving their families in permanent, agonizing uncertainty. This pervasive atmosphere of death and helplessness bled deeply into how the medieval mind interpreted the physical universe, particularly the sky above them. Because the average person could not read a map or comprehend the vastness of the earth, the sky was the only absolute boundary they knew. However, it was not viewed as a serene canopy of stars. It was seen as a massive, terrifying canvas upon which God actively painted warnings of impending doom. Celestial anomalies, which modern science easily predicts and explains, were enough to plunge entire nations into a state of paralyzed, collective terror. The appearance of a comet, for instance, was universally interpreted as a highly concentrated omen of catastrophe. The glowing tail was often depicted in manuscripts as a flaming sword hanging directly over the earth, signaling incoming plagues, the death of kings, or a divine punishment for the sins of the peasantry. When Halley's Comet appeared in the medieval sky, agricultural labor ground to a halt. People flocked to the churches, whipping themselves in frantic, desperate penance, entirely convinced that the glowing streak in the night sky was the literal harbinger of the apocalypse. But nothing shattered the fragile psychology of a medieval village quite like a total solar eclipse. In a world utterly dependent on the sun for warmth, crop growth, and the measurement of time, the sudden, unnatural blotting out of the sun in the middle of the day was an event of indescribable horror. Without astronomical warnings, the temperature would suddenly drop, the birds would stop singing, and a twilight gloom would wash over the fields. The peasants believed that God was physically turning his face away from the earth, or that a demonic entity was actively devouring the sun. The absolute silence that fell over a village during an eclipse was the silence of a people who believed they were witnessing the final, terrifying hours of human existence. They would fall to their knees in the mud, screaming their confessions into the sudden darkness, utterly convinced that the dead were about to rise from their graves and the fiery gates of purgatory were opening to swallow them whole.